All right, what do you got for me?
Yeah, so I think I've just been trying to think more about rotation a little bit. And I think I might have sent you a question of this before, something like this before, but we didn't really get to go over it. But like,
Okay.
just I think I struggle sometimes with differentiating between when you're getting just an entire and if I asked you this already, let me know, but when you're getting just an entire reorientation of the skeleton to axial skeleton to one side versus when you're getting like genuine rotation,
Okay.
and sort of where to, I guess I'm thinking about right, like, because Bill put up some things of like wides, and where to start for a highly like more compensatory wides, and basically saying, you know, if you put them in too big of a split stance or something, then you might just get people that just, they're not getting that true reciprocal activity. They're just orienting to a side or,
Sure.
yeah.
So I think for me, like one of the things that helps me at least understand what I'm going for, like from a foundational standpoint, is just thinking about hip shift mechanics first, right? So hip shift in the way that you might have, I think you understand it from like PRI, where that is like the beginning of your rotation.
Mm-hmm.
But it also starts to promote the idea of like relative motion versus absolute motion. So I think when you think about like orientation, you're going to think about like shifting too much. There's no relative motion. It's all absolute.
Right.
And it's just like everything's going to one side. So what you'll tend to see is instead of like a in the socket, out of the socket type of shift, you'll see more of like a sway, like your hips will sway to one side more than the other. But there's not this opposite happening on one side on the other. It's just like everything is just swaying to the side. So in like the golf swing, it's, you know, one of the common things that you see is like a sway instead of the actual like dissociation of your upper body from your lower body, which is what you're looking for rotation. So that's an example, but I don't know if like, you know, that would be specific enough to help you understand that. You can see that in many other specific examples. So what I see with clients and what they have a hard time with is that idea of loading into a leg, like getting back. So they might be anteriorly oriented to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are getting into like the cutting leg, the early propulsion, or you can think of it as just like the initial loading, right? Because I like to think of it that way because like you could just feel like the most load on a leg and then you're about to explode out of that. So like the load and explode idea. When you shift into that and you rotate into that, if you're not feeling this sort of in the socket, like if the knee is going out and the hip is going out, then that's where there's like an orientation issue. Yeah, you're on that side, but everything's going too far, you know, and it's not back. So I think it might be good to see this in a way where it's just, we've talked about this before with this shift here.
Yeah.
So very, very commonly it would be like, I'm on this leg here, but now I'm swayed to this side. So the idea of like not being able to feel this one pull in and like this is, I'm in this leg, but I'm really like loaded here. I haven't moved out that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we would look at, you know, some of these muscle references too. Like, do I feel my inner thigh here? Because if I'm out here, I might not. Right? Like I'll feel this out here getting a stretch or something like that. But I don't get this feeling like I'm really loaded into this leg. My nose might be over the middle of my knee. The middle of my knee might be over my big toe. Mm-hmm. So that orientation to me would be like more of a pure rotation from a practical standpoint is like you're more loaded on that side and then you can unleash and come off that side. If your hip is shifted out and your nose is sort of where you want your knee to be, but your hip is way over there, you don't have that same load.
Right.
Does that make sense? And then you'll end up moving from somewhere else. It won't be as well connected as you shift through that. And so that's where I tend to start with people is like, okay, let me see you do that type of lateral stance movement.
Yeah.
And usually it's not good. And then you have to break it down from there. And, you know, it ends up coming into hip shift mechanics. So, you know, you probably a lot of times have to start people just getting them to a more posterior orientation, which would be maybe some of your hip lift, your 90-90 hip lifts, or some version of that, just to get them more posterior first, but in a bilateral manner before you even start messing with stuff that's more rotational or shifted.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then what about from the upper body standpoint? Are you focusing more on the lower body and pelvis mechanics, and then the upper body kind of just follows?
Yeah, a lot of times, yes. But then if you think of it, again, to extend the hip shifting mechanics, would be like, all right, say I want to get myself to the left. I'll have all of those mechanics of, you know, feeling in the socket on the left. That might be hamstring. It might be, you know, internal obliques on that side, adductor. And then I'll add a reach. And, you know, if I'm doing a bilateral reach, if I reach one side more, well, it shifts me to the other side. So that would be like to start with your reaching. And then you think about the expansion idea, right? So posterior expansion, the side that's more posteriorly expanded, you're rotated more to that side, right? Mm-hmm. So that's also, you're more externally rotated on that side. So you can think about, like, do I want to promote external rotation mechanics or internal rotation mechanics? It depends on if I want to send myself to a side, or, you know, if I want to be on that side. So if I'm more externally rotated on a side, then I'm rotated to that side. But if I internally rotate on the other side, it'll help push me more to that side. So you can think of it, depends on which side you're trying to rotate towards. Yeah. And then you would say, like, okay, if I want to go to the left, I have to create more external rotation on that left. Mm-hmm. If I want to go to the right, I have to create more external rotation on that right.
Mm-hmm. I guess going off, this is sort of my next question, but thinking more about hip shifts and stuff, and like, if you think of it, you know, rotating towards the ipsilateral side is more externally rotated, and the opposite, the side you're rotating away from, is more internally rotated. I'm thinking about when, like, if you're cueing that out of the so that out of the socket cue is an internal rotation cue, or does it depend on the context? Because I feel like I don't know. I just get confused with that at times.
It depends on the context, and I think that's where, like, there's so much relativity that it's sometimes just helpful to describe things almost kinesthetically with things more than, oh, is this IR or is this ER? Yeah. You know what I mean? Because it really depends on you know, a lot of factors. So in that lateral stance position where you're a little bit leaned forward, the leg that you're going into the socket is actually more ER'd. Mm-hmm. But when you're in gait and you're more upright, if you're thinking like the stance leg, you might be more IR'd on that because you're in a different position. But your kinesthetic cue is oftentimes the same. It's like, feel these muscle references, you know, feel like you're more on one leg, you're loaded on one side more than the other. So a lot of PRI stuff is based on gait. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the reaching leg being the externally rotated leg is based on gait. And it'd be a pusher. You're using the glute max to push you back and pulling into the socket on the stance leg.
Yeah.
But that's different when you're hinged forward and you're loading into the lateral stance.
Yeah.
So, but it to me, it does matter somewhere around along the line. Like, it's always good to know that, but it's not always necessary to teach it, right? Because you may just think of the same kinesthetic cue, and then you've just leaned someone forward a little bit, but you're still, can you feel the, you know, outer heel? Can you feel like you're in that side? Mm-hmm. Can you feel like that you're getting into that adductor? Or you can just look at it positionally, is the nose over the knee over the big toe, yep. Right? And that could be all that's necessary. I think muscle references are important, though, because when you're talking about subtlety there, it's not about getting things stronger, but it is about saying, like, if I could feel this muscle reference as I'm moving a little faster, then I'm likely in the position I want to be in. Yeah. Right? Because you can't always stop and look, is my nose and my knee, but I think you can get a muscle reference pretty quickly for, okay, yeah, I'm as close to where I want to be. And then if I'm doing several reps and I feel like I'm getting tired in the areas I want to get tired, well, that probably is just a reference for position.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I use both, but it depends on the person too. Sometimes like muscle cueing will drive people, you'll just lose them. So then external cues work better. Right. But sometimes like the external cues don't work either. So then you go to the muscle reference and that works. Like you kind of need both, but they do indicate the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, we've had this conversation before about the complexities of ER, IR, depending on, where you are in space, pretty much. But I do think it's less complex to think of it as like an in the socket, out of the socket thing. Yeah. It's just that you might not be ERing when you thought you were ERing because you just changed something, right? But you are still going to create this push-pull. I think push-pull helps almost more than ER, IR sometimes.
Right.
Right, because I'm pulling towards the side I want to load. Or I'm pulling, if I'm in a more upright position, I want to pull up into the groin. That's going to be more, a lot of times it's more concentric, but if I'm pulling back into the socket when I'm in a more ER position, I may be feeling like more in my back pocket, but it is still like a sense of pulling, and just the idea would be that I just happen to be more relatively ER'd when I'm about to explode out of a lateral stance position. When I'm walking, I'm traveling forward, so like a stance position is not the same thing as a cut.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Thinking more about sports, and after watching The Last Dance and all the highlights, I just I think you notice watching a lot of basketball players just that like going for a jump shot, there tends to be that, I mean, if you call it, want to call it a valgus movement of the knees, but
just talking about this, yes. And
but I mean, what externally rotated tibias, internally rotated femurs, I feel like that gets sort of a bad rap from a lot of people. But then there's another side that's just let people move how they move, and no movement is wrong. And sort of, I'm just curious what's going on there when that happens. Why is that so common with elite performers? Because clearly it's useful.
Yeah.
And when does it become problematic, or does it?
Well, I think IR, bilateral IR of the femurs would be, it gives you more central stability concentrically, right? So, and something like shooting, you're not going into a depth that matters from a strain of the knee standpoint. Yeah. So, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially when you see tall guys do it, right? Look at Dirk Nowitzki shoot a foul shot. Mm-hmm. That's when I saw it, and I've always noticed it with Jordan. And everything Jordan does is beautiful, right? So it's I love Valgus. Anyone who's shit on Valgus, I was oh, just look at Michael Jordan shoot, because it's I can't. Anything he does is beauty to me. He's always had that, as part of he kind of loads and then he rises from it, but he doesn't get deep with it, where he's trying to explode there. So you don't see it maybe as drastically. And yeah, you do see a lot of guys do it, but when you watch Dirk shoot a foul shot, because he doesn't have the one foot in front of the other typically, I think he has both feet in the same bilateral plane on the foul line, and he's so tall, he really drops into it. He's like a giraffe drinking water.
Yeah.
But he's a super tall dude, and it gives him this central stability, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be more of that concentrically oriented, pulling things to your middle. So it's probably just a way to find stability.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. If you look at some of the statistics and the normative data on athletes that are in unilateral sports or, or asymmetrical sports, you'll tend to see a lot of differences in range of motion, but not a ton of differences in, side-to-side strength and power, which I think is interesting. At least this is what I saw when I was doing some of the TPI work. So what I think that means is that these athletes, although they have to have these different whips, from a range of motion standpoint, when you ask them to do something that doesn't need all of that range of motion, they're really good at bringing it to the center to kind of take the differences that they have from a mobility standpoint side to side and still give you the same output or similar output side to side. And that just tells me that they can bring themselves into their trunk better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you even see, like with the golf swing, you expect this huge difference in external rotation, right versus left on the backswing side, but you see that the same sequence for all professional golfers, for the most part, is to go from the center out pretty much, right? So it's like pelvis trunk, you know, up. The last thing to come through would be the club head.
Yeah.
So it's just a form of bringing things back to the center, and I think athletes do that really well, but they do that in variable ways.
Mm-hmm.
So Valgus is just a way of creating more central stability. That's
Right.
why people go there when they don't have strength in other elements, right? But if you're just trying to play, like, you don't want to be rigid. So when we're asking someone to squat and not Valgus, like, that's a slower movement. You can do that and say, like, okay, keep this sort of rigidity of not having things come in, like create a little bit more muscle tension, a little bit more force production. You do that with shooting. Shooting is such a rhythm. It's like, do what your body does naturally, but you're going to want to find a more kind of center out idea of stability.
Yeah.
And that's my hypothesis, at least.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense.
You also see a lot of, I don't want to say a lot, but I've certainly seen it in my basketball playing days. Dudes that are pigeon-toed that can really get up.
Okay.
Right. They just, you know, and there's just like a natural bounce that they have to them. And I would think it's something similar that they can,
yeah,
you know, they're more concentric, they're more up, and it's just creating that kind of central stability. They may Valgus a little bit, you know, to jump too, but they're sort of like everything's kind of going in.
So, yeah, so it's not necessarily bad by any means.
I mean, it's like sport. Well, it depends on what you're talking about. Bad, like sport has nothing to do with health.
Yeah, true.
But it's not necessarily bad for health either. No, there's no reason to think anything is. But if you see like something that is a marked, you know, like asymmetry or imbalance, and somebody does have a pain, they come in with a pain, like you may want to start by looking at the thing that they don't have. Right. So, and I don't think that has anything to do with people shooting that way. Yeah. Because that's not how somebody's, you know, that's not their posture necessarily. That just might be the way that they practice and found their most stability. Right. Yeah. So I think that's very different than just seeing someone walking around and all their gait is just super pigeon-toed. Yeah. It's not necessarily going to cause them pain, because, you know, pain is very variable. There's many things that are way outside posture that would bring someone's pain on. But if somebody does have a symptom and you're seeing that, and you then assess their movement, and it might fit into they're walking around like this all the time, sometimes that corresponds to like a more anteverted hip, right? So you can see like they can go into IR and they can't go into ER at all. But you have to assess all that. You can't just take anything from just how someone walks, but you might start to get the wheels turning just by watching that over and over again. And then whatever they can't do would be the thing that, as a therapist, you want them to be able to do better. And that's when you simplify things like that, I think it's helpful, because you're not always going to change someone's pain, because there's so many variables to pain. But if you have like a system that says like, I'm just trying to give people more options for movement, and that's your system, you know, like you just keep riding for that, keep moving forward with that, you're going to be successful, because you're going to at least help people get something that they didn't have before. And a lot of times that does help people's pain, but it's not like a one-to-one relationship, unfortunately. Yeah. And anyone who says it is full of shit, and they haven't worked with hard enough people, I would say. But it's just that that's what we do, and that's our scope. So we're not pain managers as much as we are just like trying to give people more options for movement. And it makes sense with all we know about pressure dynamics and things like that it can decrease pressure, and sure, that should help pain, but it doesn't always, because there's other things to take into account.
Right. Going back quickly, one more thing on the knees coming in. So like, I'm just thinking this from a more nerdy perspective. It like is That to me just seems like it's a way to create more, I guess you already said it, but like concentric orientation to a certain extent. And if you're trying to propel off the ground, then that could just be beneficial for that. Is that?
Yeah. And I mean, there are dudes, like if you look at, you might be able to find this on Google Images, RG3.
Yep.
Like his vertical jump, like for going for max height, was like full valgus to load it.
Yep.
That's not the same thing as shooting a basketball, though. So I don't know like how Michael Jordan's going to jump as high as possible. It's it's very different. So, but you can get more explosiveness going in and then coming up to find. That's a way to find stability that you don't have otherwise, like in a straight plane. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know that you mess with the guy, mechanic.
Yeah.
If that's just the way he goes highest there. But then you look at like RG3's injury history, like it's correlation there. You can't like say that they're the same thing.
Yeah. No, it's that. Yeah. So it sort of comes down to like if they're having a physical issue, then maybe you fix it. But like if they're that good, you just kind of let them be the athlete they are.
Yeah, but you also have to look at is like there's a big difference between looking at how somebody like does a vertical jump than how they do other things too. And so you need more context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, looking at how somebody shoots doesn't give you information about how their hips move necessarily.
Yep.
Because it's a strategy to give them a good performance.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look at other things, and again, you're backtracking from injury, maybe because he jumps that way, he also has, just no stability in the muscles that would counter valgus. Right. So then we have to give him some of that, but you don't know that just by watching him jump. That just might be his strategy for getting the highest jump, right, in a combine, which really matters in your livelihood. So it's like, I don't think there is a perfect way to get the best performance because everybody is different there.
Right.
But as a therapist or even as a strength and conditioning professional that is working with an athlete, like you're not trying to make them better at their sport. They have coaches for that. You're trying to give them what they don't have physically in some ways to just, either make sure that they don't break down or, give them more attributes that they would need to get better at their sport from a global capacity standpoint more than like a specific to their sport standpoint.
Right.
Okay. And I just think like every sport has it where there's just different ways to be good at things. Like there's different ways to throw a football. There's different ways to shoot a basketball. But that doesn't give you information about anything else. But you need more context before you start making decisions whether you should make change there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think I guess I'm kind of on the sports thing today, but now I'm so thinking about precession or left precession and everything. I find it interesting. I don't know if this is even as much a question, but just thinking about track and how you're always sprinting to that. You're always sprinting to the left. I get confused because it's like, okay, you're going with, the angular momentum of your internal organs. But at the same time, it's like if people have a tendency to be oriented to the right somewhat, that makes me think it would be harder to run that way. And I don't know, like is there ever I don't know. I'm just thinking about that and agility as well and cutting and how it's like, I think at least from my own perspective, if I'm sprinting around a track the normal way, what is that? Counterclockwise, it's way easier than sprinting clockwise. But then if I go to do a cut, it's way easier for me to cut to the right. And it just seems opposite to me. And I'm wondering how that's
to plant and load on the right, you're saying?
No, I'm saying if my left foot, if I'm going from left to right.
So loading the left and moving to the right.
Left is on the outer leg. And I don't know. I just am curious if that's just because I'm weird, or like why it's somewhat different, why it feels different from a sprinting perspective versus a cutting perspective.
Well, I have to give like your specific cutting more thought, but I'll give you this where when we think about like being oriented to the right or being more like loaded on the right typically than on the left, from a stance perspective, think of a current moving to the left, right? And you have to turn into that current and you have to use your right leg to stabilize you from getting knocked over. If you take that idea though out of it, right? Like, and say you don't have your stance leg trying to block the left current. So let me do this in standing here. All right, current is coming from the left. I'm going to turn into the current and I'm going to like use my right leg to load that to stop that momentum. So that ends up being like why we are likely more in the right.
Yep.
So it just has to do with, you know, current. Okay, so current's coming left.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm turning into that. So then think about all of this. I'm turning. And there's different ways then we fight that current.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it'll be more natural. If something's coming at me this way, if I load my left, I'm going to fall more over on the left, right? So I'm going to turn into my right and stay heavy. And then I might use my left leg to sort of push me more into the right. So then you have this push-pull again, but the pull is on the right because that's sort of holding your ground as this is coming this way. Now I can get knocked back and then it's like my last resort is to hang out on the left, but there's not a lot of people that are living that way because you'd be, you know, so off balance. So then you end up being more on the right.
Right.
That's with that idea. Now, if you do something like where your feet are coming off the ground with running, you'll go back to the left, right? Like you've taken that anchor of trying to stabilize your position off the ground. So a good example of that, which, you know, corresponds to running and sprinting, would be you sit on the ground in a long sit and you ever do that drill where you just like pump your arms as hard as you can, like a sprinting drill? Most people go to the left.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's nothing holding you now back to the right. Okay. So now you just go with the current. So I think that's a way to think about the difference there. Now, from your cutting perspective, like I would see a lot of people plant better to the right still. So that might, but there's reasons to be both, right? Yeah. If you are, say, you know, like over supinated or something on one side more than the other, like you just might feel unstable on one side. Yeah. So I think like feet play a big role on feeling more stable on one side versus the other, and then hip angle matters. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are more in their right side, but when you ask them to pistol, they'll be better on their left because they're, you know, theoretically, because their left foot is flatter. So it's like a better stability point, and they can just kind of get down into that hip a little bit more. It's not like they're necessarily more oriented there. It's just that it's just a better balance point for them. And if you're more supinated on the right side, mm-hmm. When you have to stabilize on that, it's almost like you go too much and it's like you're rolling over the ankle. So it's actually harder to get into that side for you, maybe because of foot mechanics. And that's just one example, like thinking quickly of it. But there's
a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
There's still like that idea of like you're likely going to plant on a right side better, but then it depends on angles and things like that to see, like you just might feel better planting on your left because you're more balanced on that side when you're going in that specific direction and angle.
Or maybe it's just that if the left side is naturally more propulsive right, then you just feel better coming out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it depends on the when of when you feel better.
Yeah.
Cut. Yeah. You know, and I think because I train a lot of the early propulsion with people, it just that I see, because I'm not seeing all the like professional athletes too. I'm seeing like people that just I need to teach them how to, you know, rotate for the first time or just, you know, take them out of other mechanics. So that early propulsion is a good place to stay and pause and feel like what your body can't do. So I think of that a lot of times as like, okay, that's where you'll find that easier on the right. So you might find that easier on the right, but you might have a harder time coming out of that.
Yeah, like you just kind of get buried in that hip.
Yeah. Yeah. So that makes sense. There's a lot of different ways to think about it, but it tends to fit with the same thing. Yeah. So if you're never like fully loading that left hip as much, it's just like you're always coming off of it. You just might feel, better coming off of that, getting back to the other side.
Right. And then, so you're saying it kind of differs when you're anchored on the ground versus when you're in the air, pretty much. Because when you're anchored on the ground, okay. So when you're in the air, you're kind of going with that procession.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, or when you're anchored, you're fighting against it.
Right.
So that's why you would be more on your right side, which was definitely something I thought, and I don't know that they explain it that way in PRI, but that's something I got from the intensive, and it made a lot of sense when we were thinking of it from that perspective, because you do see those contradictions in your head, but then when you think of it as not just like the organs are bigger on one side than the other, but you do think of it as like an angular momentum thing, then it starts to make a little bit more sense, where, you'll be loaded on one side more frequently, but you might, like when you're taking that load off, you might feel like you're going the other way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting for me now to think about that in terms of like a pitcher or something, and how if you watch like lefties usually just tend to look somewhat different than righties and how they throw.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting for me to think about, like, I guess they're going against the current, but at the same time they're anchored on the ground for most of that. So then they're pushing off their left and pushing themselves to the right.
And one of the things we talked about at the intensive, and I haven't like looked into data on this, but is that lefties tend to have they don't come from up as high. So again, the left side will tend to have less external rotation and all of that. So a different angle is necessary oftentimes for a left-handed thrower than a right-handed thrower. You see it in basketball, though, that there's definitely a different shooting form that you get from a lefty and a right, typically.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's just probably a way to manage that momentum. It's like you practice, though, from when you're young, right? So you don't think anything of it. It's just like, okay, I'm more comfortable with my left hand, and then you square yourself up in a way that just starts making more shots.
Yeah,
but
you stick with it.
I love looking at like a good lefty shooter. I just think there's something smooth about it. But
yeah, I mean, well, I'm a lacrosse guy, but I think about it the same way. Like, there's something about lefties that are just, I don't know.
It might just be like something that's about dudes that are unique, right? Because it's more unique to be lefty. Yeah. My brother's a lefty, and I would say like he's a really good basketball player. Like, from relatively so. He played for St. Joe's as a walk-on, but he was a really good shooter. But I would say like he didn't have too different of a shot. He didn't have a lot of rotation on his shot, though, and it was just interesting. I don't know if that's something I would have to look into, if that's something that has to do with like a lefty, or that was just his particular shot.
Okay.
But he used to get pissed off because people used to joke, like make fun of him, or not make fun of him, but just say like, "Oh, you're only a good shooter because you're lefty," and it has to do with like the rotation of the earth. People had this theory that not understanding the precession and things like that, but just people would say it's like the rotation of the earth or something like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I haven't heard that. Okay, cool. I have just a couple questions specifically about my gymnastics program. Is that
cool?
Okay?
Yes, absolutely. That's perfect.
So looking at like I was doing the thoracic bridge the other day, program, not the actual thing. Like I was trying to fit sort of in my head, thinking about like the thoracic and lumbar extension, like based exercises, and sort of just trying to think about how they fit into things and what I'm necessarily accomplishing there. Because if like I'm already coming from a position where maybe I'm pretty extended, for lack of a better word, to begin with, like what am I going after there, and what are things that should be seeking to feel in those positions?
All right, so think about it from the opposite end of things, like belly to thigh flexion, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's one of the values of just getting down to the bottom of a squat, right? To me, it's about feeling like you're compressing one side so much that you can actually feel expansion on the other side, or you can feel expansion into that compression. So if we get you into like a position of deep flexion, belly to thigh, you feel a pinch, but you can inhale and get rid of that pinch pretty much without like totally changing your position just by using your breath. Well, that's great feedback now to get you to flex and externally rotate better, right? That belly to thigh idea.
Yeah.
So think about extension similarly. Now you have to have the mechanics down first, and I think you do. Not everybody does, but going from a space where you understand what you're trying to feel, I think from a breathing standpoint,
mm-hmm.
it's good to take yourself gradually in a slow manner, which you're doing with all of those things, right? You're not rushing into it. It's not like fast Olympic lifting for time. It's just take yourself to where you feel the onset of compression or the onset of like you can't breathe anymore, and then try to breathe there.
Right.
So don't think of them as stretches. Think of them as like I'm getting myself into a posture, which you're not going to be good at. I'm not good at it, but I think there's a lot of value to bringing yourself into spinal extension with the idea of the expansion compression mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now you take yourself into a position where maybe you just put your hands on a wall where you can lock in, and maybe you just go to here, right? So you can think of it as you're compressing on the backside, but you don't have to be. I mean, you relatively maybe, but you can think, okay, I'm going to reach away. Now I'm going to try to put a breath in the front and the back and low. I'm going to try to expand everywhere. Now my next exhale is going to be ribs down, belly button in, pelvic floor ascended. Then let me reach a little bit more and just go for it and visualize your whole body moving as a unit. Mm-hmm. So expansion can be also thought of as every vertebrae distracting instead of just like hinging into extension.
Okay.
Because you don't want to avoid postures. It's just the model will help you understand like, okay, that's going to be something. If you just go at all costs for however I can get back here,
mm-hmm.
you're going to compress like a mother effer. You're going to lift your ribs. But if you understand those mechanics, now it's actually good to get some of that feedback. Like I love it. I think it's helped my mobility more to do stuff like that where there's a way of, it's sort of like adding load. And this is something I think I told you about when we were at the intensive. A lot of the guys there, big and strong, they needed load to make change, right? So you can do that with like farmer carries and different things like that. You can do it with inversion, which is a form of adding load to moving pressure. But you can also add like a compression that you wouldn't get in any other way to see, can I breathe into that compression? All right. And that's not the only thing you're doing, right? Because you're also doing stuff that opens you on the other side, but don't discount those, because I think you can get a lot of value there, but just make it about the breath control more than about like, you're not going to do a thoracic bridge anytime soon. So just be patient with it. Yeah. And I think it's helpful to think about those movements as categories and stuff that you may never attain and you don't need to attain, but they're any moving closer to that,
mm-hmm.
you're fit. Let's just take out of like the equation any of these models of like movement options. If you can do more gymnastic stuff, you got more movement options.
Yeah.
And it's just like, but in getting that process, like you won't get your thoracic bridge just by forcing it. You'll only get it by taking it slow and actually figuring out those breathing mechanics and figuring out like how to move from your whole body. And that's one of the things I like about them, is because they're sort of self-limiting. You can try to force some things early on, but eventually you're going to hit a wall until you figure out how to use your whole body. And then you'll also figure out like, all right, I might not get past here just because until I free up some stuff, and that might not happen. It's like not everybody gets better, like an unending spectrum. You know what I mean? It's just, But it does give you a good sense of your limitations if you have the underlying knowledge and information of what you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can find the same thing in a yoga practice.
Yeah.
So there is, there's no movement practice that you look at as like, oh, those people are, they're hurting themselves. There's a lack of knowledge and a lack of awareness. And that's constant. We all have it in some way. We have to keep trying to gain more. But I think if you see any movement practice and you understand some of these fundamentals, then you'll be able to use them and you can figure out what works best for you. But going into your limitations are sometimes the best way to feel yourself like start to move better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So it's like, so I'm thinking of, it's not like a sleeper stretch, but like that cross body when you're prone, that's pretty much just, you're trying to essentially breathe into that like basically trying to expand pump handle on that side.
Yeah.
And then, so am I like, do I go to the point where the onset of that pinching or sort of comes and then try to breathe into it and see if I can get myself out of it in that sense?
But prioritize no pain that you can't control. Let's put it that way. But if you can get to the onset of pain and you can breathe yourself out of pain, then you're right where you want to be. You've just given yourself some information and it's like, okay, this is the value of this breath, right? It just took me out of pain. If I don't do it, I'm going to get compression that I don't want. It's uncomfortable, right? And don't think of it as like I'm jamming bone on bone. Just think of it as like this is a sensation that my body finds threatening.
Yep.
Right? And especially if it's something you've had before in some negative way and it stopped you from performing your sport, right? There's a whole history there. But that could be a good thing if you're going with controlled movement. So you prioritize like don't work into pain, but maybe you can use pain as feedback. Then it's your breath control. So that cross body, I think they call it posterior capsule stretch. That's been one of the best for me because at first it was just all about like trying to feel the stretch in the backside. And I didn't think about it as like this pump handle on the front side. And then as I started getting more information and more just thinking about like the expansion compression idea, that has become such a different mobility stretch for me. Or it's just like I'm getting so much farther, but I can also feel the pump handle mechanics in a way that's sort of indisputable, right? Like where if I'm here, like sometimes I'm like, yeah, I can feel this when I take an inhale, but here it's like, as I breathe into that spot, I'm like literally blowing myself up. Like I can feel like a balloon is filling up and then I'm going farther.
Right.
And I think that's super valuable, right? Because you can feel the difference between like your pec's going to want to guard versus like you're literally blowing that pec up and it just gives you a totally different sensation. Yeah.
Yeah. I was trying to do that. The duration is really helpful because by the end of it, it starts to feel a lot better. But
and if you can get your rhythm of breathing, it starts to change. Like initially you're threatened by an uncomfortable position. So that's why you need that much time, because you'll start thinking about the breathing from maybe a mechanical standpoint. It's like, okay, I got to get, expansion here, and I got to tighten or pull in when I exhale. But the threshold will oftentimes be too high early on to actually feel like movement happening. And as you spend more time there, your body actually starts to figure that out. That's been my experience. So hopefully that's what you get there too. Yeah. And if it's hurts too much, like then find something else. But I think you're a person that would do well with that stuff. And I think as you continue to do well, and then you have questions like this, it's a nice teaching foundation, right? Because you'll find that your body's getting into all of these different, I don't want to use the word functional, but I'll use the word functional, these different orientations that are not like joint specific so much, but they are just being able to be on the ground better, right? And using the ground as a way to create more mobility. But then it's also like, if you can reach your arm across and you don't feel uncomfortable with that, well, you can actually lay on your stomach with your arm across. Like that's going to carry over to feeling better lying on your side when you sleep, because you don't feel like you have to be here all the time, right? So if you think about like being on the ground with more ease, is a super functional thing, right? It's a super valuable thing. So using the ground as your way of mobilizing, but all doing it at different angles, I think you're just going to start to feel better. Like you're going to want to be on the ground more. You're going to feel like you can transition up and down off the ground a lot easier.
Yeah.
And that's optimal mobility once you get outside of sport. Like in sport, it's like, what do you need to do to be better at your sport a lot of times?
Yeah.
But when you get outside of that, it's like, to me, it's like, can I get up and down off the ground with ease? And then can I, transition with ease and all of those things? I can't think of anything else that actually asks for more mobility as opposed to like ground mobility. And deep squat would be part of that. Like if you could sit in a deep squat, that becomes a seat. Now you have an option to rest. So like having more options to rest might be your way of thinking of like what's optimal mobility.
Mm-hmm. That ties sort of into what you were talking about the last time we talked, which I just thought was cool, was like having sort of phases of things with different emphasis. Like it's like, all right, maybe you are going to go after strength or something in this phase and like understand that certain things are going to drop off, but then it's like, well, you're going to have something else of focus after that, which goes after something else. And it's just cool to think about in that sense.
It's a long life. Like when you're outside of athletics, it took me a while to drop the idea of thinking of physical training as like still being an athlete.
Yeah. And
CrossFit didn't help that when I got into it, but it did help me see like what I sucked at.
Yeah.
Because I was very specialized in the sports that I was playing for a while, basketball mostly. And it was like, okay, I feel like I like this feeling of feeling like an athlete again, but it's like I really have to go back to like square one on some of this stuff because I've never done it before. And there's literally no carryover from the other stuff I've done. If anything, it makes me much worse at it.
Yeah.
And then, so like having that as a start and then taking away the competition after that, right? So then it's like, oh, I don't care if I become like good at it from a competitive standpoint, but I just like get better than I've ever been because I never did it before. Well, then now that becomes sort of, there's no pressure on your programming. It's like, like sometimes I can be working on getting my deadlift more. Sometimes I can be working on getting my body weight stuff in order. Sometimes I can be working on just feeling like more comfortable in my own body. Sometimes I can feel like I'm working on running and cardio. It becomes a little bit more of an exploration, and I find that more fun. But everybody's personality is a little bit different too. There's going to be people, like of the 10 people that listen to this, some of them will be like, this pussy, it's like he's doesn't have a heart, to go towards it. But I used to have that mindset, and it's just like, who are you competing with after a while?
Yeah.
Like Instagram, but I think you'll find that depending on your clientele, to be able to just get people not to be afraid, you have to backtrack from that mentality of competition, like, because that's what's sold a lot of times. So you have to show them that it's just like wherever you are is good. It's better than not doing it at all.
Right.
And having a way of looking at that, but then you can do that with yourself. And I think that promotes versatility. Like you already are going to have a base of your athleticism. Like you wouldn't want to go back and not do that, because you're going to have this base that other people won't have if they didn't have your movement background. But as you know, you might also have some limitations that you just never get over. Yeah. Because that's your starting point. Some of it's your history, some of it's your genetics, whatever it is, you don't know. Yeah. It doesn't matter. Like if you have the right process, then you're just kind of always checking where you are, but there's nothing that really should be out of bounds. It's just a matter of knowing like when you're kind of going beyond your control. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think the gymnastics stuff is a nice counter to, say, like doing like a hypertrophy program. Yeah. But it doesn't, like, you're not weak when you're training it, right? Like you're still getting stronger. You're just getting stronger in a different way. And then whenever you want to, you go back to the hypertrophy stuff. Like, yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you find valuable about hypertrophy? I can tell you what I find valuable, because like I go back to it a lot. It's just, But what do you find valuable when you do that work?
I mean, I feel like I like the ability to feel like I can just handle a lot of load and volume.
Yeah.
And that just feels good from like a anti-fragile perspective.
Right.
And obviously like getting a pump is pretty fun.
Yeah.
But I mean, those are probably like the ability to handle volume is probably the biggest thing that I feel like I find valuable from that, is just that it's like I can target volume in a certain area and just like bring up a lagging area, and then my ability to handle stress in whatever area is just feels better. So
I agree.
Yeah.
And I would say like there's also there's this something you can't recreate with your body weight or even like kettlebells. When you're doing like heavy shit with barbells and bilateral stuff too,
yeah,
you're just creating a lot of stress, and you're building more and more tolerance to that stress.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to promote also this internal hormonal stuff that gets you feeling growth hormone, testosterone, and that's a cool feeling.
Yeah.
if it's not like kind of getting away from you a little bit, and I can feel these differences, like in just like emotions, and it makes me feel more human. If I don't touch that corner of hypertrophy and just really like hard training, but also like heavy training, like pushing myself a little bit, then I feel like I miss out on that. But if I do that too much, like I feel like I'm always kind of struggling the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like I get like a high from that, and I like that feeling. And there's sometimes where just other stuff won't cut it, but then you need the balance. And I think the more versatile your training regimens are, the more you've explored, the more you start to use your movement practices as like just a way to manage life. It's like, okay, now I've kind of, this isn't feeling great for me, or I need to change, or I need to calm myself down. Well, I got this practice to calm myself down.
Yeah.
And that could be like mixing it up every day, or that could just be like, okay, I'm going to do that for a certain amount of weeks. Right. You won't get better at like a task if you mix it up every day.
Right.
But if you're just sort of in a maintenance mode and you just want to feel good, then there's no reason to do that. Again, if you're not competing with anything, then that sometimes becomes what you're using your movement practice for. And then you can choose, it's like, now I want to get something better,
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to spend 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, the program calls for to get that better. And most likely you will get that better. It just might not be like where you want it to be. Like it depends on how lofty your goals are, but like, it's going to be hard to not get better if you're doing similar things for a certain amount of time.
Right. Well, and then the thing is, I mean, when you're not an athlete, there's no like deadlines you really have to hit with anything. So it's
just see where you get. Be in a program, because there's definitely value to like staying consistent with the program, but you don't have to do that all the time. And I think a lot of the people that we follow, that I've seen, like, they get pissed off when people aren't following a program. You know what I mean? It's like, well, like, why? Like, I don't need, like, I feel content with this exploration and play. Like, I'm learning something in this process. I'm not like wasting my time. Like, how do you know that someone's wasting their time? Right? Like, how do you know what their thought process is when they're moving and, exploring something, or what they're using it for, in their day to day? Like, exercise can, for a lot of people, is just to like get their mind right.
Yeah.
So, like, if you're a trainer and that's all you're doing is just randomly mixing shit up for people, and then you might not have another go-to, and that could be a problem. But sometimes that's what your clients need too, depending on a lot of variables. How often you see them, like how bored they might get doing the same shit, over and over again. And you just have to make that judgment call. But I do think there's a lot of like this is how it should be out there. But when you really start to take competition away, and social media becomes competition after a certain point in time, then it's like, it's sort of more fun to explore different movement practices, and especially the ones that you're you're not good at, because you'll get good really quick with them.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can't play basketball anymore with people because I have like a standard, but I don't have a standard with anything else.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, this is just fun. You know, this is anything that I'm better with, and I feel like I'm not getting older as fast.
Yeah. That's cool, right.
You probably haven't escaped like still being decent at lacrosse, where like it's, when you play it, you don't feel like it, you just are an old man. But that's how I feel with basketball. And it's not that I don't have like any of the skills left. It's just that like, it's like subtle stuff where, one, I'll get tired really quick, but like my accuracy of like throwing passes and things like that is just like a little bit off. So I think like everything feels the same, and then it's like I'm throwing the ball in the bleachers. And so I'm happy to just go shoot around by myself, because like I could still do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm still luckily in like okay at lacrosse now, but I think I'm gonna probably feel old soon. So I mean, not playing much, but
it'd be nice to have other physical projects.
Yeah, exactly. Gymnastics being one of them.
Yeah, it's an easy one to do on your own too. Like you don't need to eventually start getting equipment like I have, like stall bars and things like that. But
I know. I was gonna say I feel like I need some stall bars, because some of the stuff they do is on it, and I'm able to sort of modify it, but I'm like,
yeah,
use in my room.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.